ladies and gentlemen, Ted Barris.
And thanks to Eric and the team here for helping me set up the technology today. I was going to do my full presentation on the Battle of Britain, but you all know the story. So I'm going to skip all the preamble, bypass all of that, and get to the meat of what I do. And that is, I collect the same sorts of things that Alec and Mike do, but the people side of it. They gather the stories too, but for me, it's the heart and soul of any book is the ability to get the stories of the young men and women who were part of this great battle and put them into a narrative that illustrates how powerful their influence and their involvement and their dedication to this particular endeavor was. So I'm going to start with a phrase that I use to start off my presentations. This is my 62nd presentation on this book since I was here back in early September. And I never tire of it, but today I've switched things around. So in many cases, this is my first presentation of this particular one. So I put this on the screen, and this really pisses off Americans when I put up the greatest air battle of the Second World War, because they say, Ted, didn't you see Masters of the Air? And I said, yes. And how many of you saw it? Just most of you? Yeah. It's intense. It's extraordinarily crafted by the digital animation and the computers that they were able to do that. And it's a great story of the United States Army Air Force from 1943 to 45. So I remind the Americans that if it wasn't for 1940, there wouldn't have been a 1943 to 45. And then they say, well, yeah, I guess perhaps that's true. So I'm going to start with a fairly important political cartoon that was published in the spring of 1940. And it illustrates very much the moment in time in the Second World War. It depicts a British soldier on the shores of England with his fist in the air, defiantly against the German bombers approaching England and the tempestuous seas around him. And it was created by David Lowe of the Evening Standard, and the caption reads, "Very well, alone." And that's because in 1939, of course, Hitler had rolled into Poland, had occupied it through the winter. The phony war gives way to the invasion ultimately of Norway and Denmark in the spring of 1940, and then through the Low Countries, Luxembourg, Belgium, the Netherlands, and on into France. And we were in retreat. The Allies are fleeing ahead of the Blitzkrieg and destroying as much of our equipment as we were departing as possible. And I point this out because it's not as well known as perhaps it should be that among the things the Germans found in our retreat from France in June of 1940 was Royal Air Force radar. We thought we had destroyed everything in our retreat. And of course, at Dunkirk, we managed to get 335,000 men off the shore in a matter of days, which is a great victory for life, but not for the war's endeavor. Here's a bit of film from that period depicting the state of things as we have pulled out of France. And by the way, that reference to the radar the Germans found is significant because when they found it, they dismissed it as deficient. They thought it was second grade. Their Freya was much more efficient, and therefore any RAF radar would be useless. And so the Luftwaffe dedicates one day of the Battle of Britain to attacking the radar in Britain. Interesting, that first mistake. Okay, so here's a little bit of film and voiceover of this moment as the Battle of Britain is about to begin.
July 1940. The German armies that have conquered Europe are preparing to cross the English Channel and invade Britain. But to win the Battle of Britain, the Germans must have command of the air. They must destroy Britain's Royal Air Force. With no air force, Britain will be defenseless. Now Britain's last line of defense are the fighter pilots. Flying with the Royal Air Force and with the Royal Canadian Air Force are more than 100 Canadians.
And in fact, those numbers are erroneous. But the reason I wanted to show this clip, and you can see in this last captured frame Spitfires taking off, there was a huge argument within Air Ministry and the Royal Air Force during the 1930s, what would be the most effective defensive weapon in the defense of Britain against the Germans? And Bomber Command felt it should be bombers, so manufacturing should increase of bombers. Fighter Command felt it should be fighters. Hugh Dowding obviously felt that fighters were the most effective defense, and he won that argument. And so the ramping up of aircraft production in the 1930s in particular, which falls to the first Canadian of my talk, and I'm not going to go into great detail because I'm sure you know this story, Max Aitken, who was the newspaper magnate from New Brunswick, goes to Britain in 1910, is an elected MP, and then Churchill chooses him to be the Minister of Aircraft Production. And he literally puts aircraft production in Britain on its head because they were falling short of quota all through the winter and the spring of 1940. But the minute that Beaverbrook is there, fighter production exceeds quota in May, June, July, August, and September, which was these were the critical months. That story's in the book, but I wanted to focus for a second on the important phrase that Churchill writes. And I always thought that he wrote the "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few" in the aftermath. We've all got in our libraries the 6 volumes of his memoirs from the Second World War. He wrote it on August the 15th, when the outcome of the battle was long from known, long before completion. He's underground at either Uxford or Stanmore, watching the battle unfold on the plotting maps. And he's watching, as much as he's watching the maps, he's watching the faces of his officers. And he writes on a piece of paper, and that night he's heard going back to Chequers, mumbling in the car. And on August the 18th or thereabouts, he rises in Parliament and delivers this great line. So who are the few? Just move this cursor off here. There were 2,500 Brits, which seems like a lot, but not really when you consider the entire British force. 2,500 ground crew and pilots. There were 147 Poles. There were 101 New Zealanders, again, ground crew and pilots. There were 87 Czechs, and yes, there were 7 Americans. But wait for it, there were 300 Canadians. Now, I defy anybody in this room, and I'll buy her or him a drink if you can prove it, that we learned in any level of our education, elementary, high school, university, or college, that Canadians were the second largest contingent in the Battle of Britain. Anybody? I didn't think so. We certainly weren't taught that. So I thought I'd start by telling you a little bit about the few. A little bit of context. We all know that the Great War was the war to end all wars. After the Great War, the Robert Borden government said, there's no room in aviation in our lives. The Great War has made aviation unnecessary, military aviation unnecessary, so let's just scale it back. Aviation is a war business, his minister without portfolio said. There's no place for it even in civilian aviation. So we start to cut back our Air Force. No training, no production. And Alex, you mentioned this, and Mike, you alluded to it too. We were in a stage between the wars when production of air crew and aircraft and training were at the minimum, scaled way back. At the same time, curiously, civilian aviation was exploding. Air Board at federal government level encouraged weekend flying. Men and women were paying a few bucks to get lessons to get their private pilot's licenses. And this image from St. John in 1931 illustrates what we now recognize every fall when the CNE Air Show happens over Labor Day weekend down on the lakeshore. This was happening in St. John, only then it was one of the stops of the Trans-Canada Air Pageant. And in 1931, people gathered. Look at the cars in the background, hundreds of them. People were flocking to see these aircraft at the airfield. This is a little corner of St. John known as Milledgeville. And there was also the location of the Air Club, which is why this was all happening. So people come in droves, and then once they've had a chance to see the aircraft, they're now put back behind a restraining rope, right? So let's imagine you guys are all behind this restraining rope, right? Nobody's allowed out on the airstrip because this is where the gypsy moth is about to take off. And the rope is preventing you from going out beyond that line. And then suddenly, a kid in a Boy Scout outfit hops over the rope, gets on the wrong side of the rope, goes along, and adults are tisking him. You don't belong up there, get back here. It's just a kid. Then he leaves the rope, and he wanders out to the gypsy moth, puts his hand on the tailplane, runs along the fuselage, down onto the wingtip, jumps up onto the wing, gets into the cockpit, fires it up, goes zigzagging down the airstrip, takes off, and does 10 minutes of aerobatics over the spectators. He was part of the show. His name was Kilpatrick Slanders. He was born in Saskatoon, raised in St. John. Like all kids, loved Air Force and aviation magazines. wins a contest, gets a helmet and goggles as a prize, gets his private pilot's license. He's the youngest Canadian in the Dominion at 15 to have a private pilot's license in that time. Then he rents Gypsy Moth. I think that's what he's standing next to there. He and his buddy drop leaflets over St. John. Let's say, Adrian, you've got a auction on Saturday and you want everybody in St. John to know about it. Print it out in leaflets. These guys are paid to go up and fly and dump the leaflets over St. John so everybody comes to your auction, right? Problem was the leaflets kept gumming up the tailplane and they nearly crashed a couple of times. So they stopped that. This is Pat a little bit later. Now, something happened in Britain that caught his eye, and the eye of a lot of other Canadians and young men across the Commonwealth. Unlike Canada, which was scaling back its military aviation program, the RAF recognized the war was coming, and they offer what was called a direct entry scheme for young men across the Commonwealth to come to Britain on their own dime and to try out for military enlistment in the Royal Air Force. They had to make the grade in order to become RAF material. If they did, the automatic return for a direct entry into the RAF on this plan was to make them RAF officers. It was a short service commission. Meant that maybe you have, Alex, you're 20 years old in 1935. Maybe you don't have 3 square meals in the day or a day job, but you got a private pilot's license in your back pocket. And it's 1935. Would you go and try to get into the Royal Air Force and become an officer? You bet you would. And 118 guys, just like Pat did, went there, made the grade, and here's the hitch. Do the math. It's 1935, you're 20, you got your pilot's license, you're in the RAF. 6 years later, you had to give them 6 years service, you're frontline Battle of Britain fighter pilot. And that's how some of the Canadians came to be in the Battle of Britain. He got sick, however, had to return to St. John for a while, recovers, tries as a mercenary to get into the Finnish Air Force against the Russians, then into the Royal Norwegian Air Force fighting the Luftwaffe, doesn't get there in time in either case, manages to get into the French Foreign Legion just as everybody's retreating out of France. So he's all the way back to England suddenly by the skin of his teeth, and he gets thrown into a squadron, number 242 RAF All-Canadian Squadron. And here's how that squadron came to be. As the war was looming, Mackenzie King, with a very vivid memory of the First World War, its casualties and conscription, is frightened that Canada will get into the same rut again of having to deal with a lot of casualties, conscription, and big budgets. He gets a note from Vincent Massey in London, who recognizes the RAF is screaming for pilots. And Massey mentions that we trained aircrew in Canada during the Great War. Why don't we do the same in the Second World War? King thinks this is brilliant because all of it will be here in Canada, the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, about which I've written an entire book if you're interested. Essentially, it means that it's homegrown. All of those participating will be volunteers, no conscription, controlled budgets, and that's our commitment to Mother England. Perfect. Except that as we get closer to the war, late in 1939, after he signed the BCATP into agreement, the RAF now says, how about having Canadians as a confined separate entity squadron in the looming Battle of Britain? King says, we're $1.75 billion in debt trading aircrew. You're on your own. The RAF says, okay. There are about 118 Canadians scattered all across the RAF. They find 242 Squadron, which is an orphan squadron, and they plunk them all, many of them, into that squadron, ground crew and pilots. That's how 242 comes to be. Now, coincidentally, and Slanders gets there eventually, coincidentally, these young men in 242 had fought in France. They'd lost 7 pilots. Most of their gear was left behind when they fled from France. They are now back in Coltishall in London, north of London, with very few aircraft, very little equipment. They don't even have their clothes or their tools. They have nothing. And the RAF has bigger problems to deal with than a bunch of Canadians who are whining and complaining about not being in the war, in the looming Battle of Britain. So they're forgotten. And then suddenly, a new commanding officer, a squadron leader, is assigned to take control of all Canadian 242 Squadron, none other than Douglas Bader, the legless ace who crashed his aircraft in a stunt in 1931, nearly killed himself, lost both legs, gets prosthetic legs, learns how to walk, to dance, to golf, and fly again, and suddenly, after rising back into RAF circles, is given number 242 as a commanding post. And here's a clip from Reach for the Sky when spit and polish Bader meets a bunch of disgruntled, disheartened, disjointed Canadians at Coltachol.
Your pilots are mostly Canadians, and they've had a very rough time in France. They're a bit fed up, especially with authority. They want good leadership. I think you might be the man.
I understand, sir. I'll do my best.
Well, good luck in your first command. We shall soon need every fighter squadron we've got. The Luftwaffe seems to be gathering across the channel.
Who's in charge here? Who's the senior man? Isn't anyone in charge?
I guess I am.
What's your name?
Turner.
Turner, what?
Sir.
Come on, jump to it!
Not bad. Not bad at all.
I hasten to add, this is long before digital animation computers could do this sort of thing. That's real flying. And it's gussied up because it's a bit of Hollywood. But the facts are there that they didn't get along initially, and ultimately Bader realizes what they've gone through, 242 in France, and apologizes. Sends them off to the tailor at Coltachol to get new clothes and shoes. The respect builds, and ultimately 242 becomes one of the crack squadrons because they're led by a man who is driven. Now, I didn't get into any of this earlier, I normally do in the discussion. There's a lot of fighting between Hugh Dowding at the Chief Marshal's level and the squadron level, between whether it makes more sense to send up one squadron to scramble against the bombers, which was Dowding's tactic, or in Bader's eyes, to send up a bunch of them, a big wing. And that argument goes on throughout. And partly because of his determination to make these young Canadians the best in fighter squadrons, he drives them hard, and you get a sense from all the records. Hugh Dowding doesn't agree with Bader. Bader doesn't agree with Hugh Dowding. He's going through his intermediary. I guess it's Lee Mallory and Keith Park. In any case, there's Bader in the middle. Neil Campbell's from St. Thomas. These are among the 118 guys who made their own way over to Britain. Hugh Tamblyn was from Saskatchewan, Turner from Toronto, Willie McKnight was from Edmonton, Hilly Brown was from Winnipeg. These guys have all made their own way there, and they're essentially living up to their commitment of the Short Service Commission 6 years, and that's why they're there. Okay, this is not just a man's story, it's a woman's story, as Alex and Mike have made clear too in our presentations earlier. This is the story of Elsie McGill, whose story I didn't know when I first started digging into this Battle of Britain story. She was born in 1905, gets homeschooled, goes to UBC at 16, then goes to the University of Toronto, becomes the first woman at U of T to get an electrical engineering degree in 1927. Then in 1929, she goes to the University of Michigan, and prior to her writing her finals for the MA, she contracts polio, which means she writes her exams from her hospital bed, and she becomes a sensation. This is a remarkable woman. She's breaking glass ceilings when we never even heard the term. She gets hired by Fairchild Aircraft in the construction of Bolingbroke's at Longueuil, and she gets invited into the Engineering Institute of Canada, and that gives her a platform to talk about the things she knows: aircraft performance, aircraft design, aircraft engineering. Again, a woman speaking out in a man's world. Coincidentally, in 1938, Canadian Car and Foundry up in Fort William, now Thunder Bay, gets a contract from Air Ministry in Britain to build 40 Hawker Hurricane fighter aircraft in Fort William. The pieces, the parts are sent over, and Elsie gets the jobs. She's 2IC to the engineering operation, actually building the aircraft at Fort William. And she has to deal with 3,600 schematic diagrams to do the assembly of the Hurricanes, 800 different assembly processes, and by the way, she comes up with a brand new invention nobody else has thought about along the way. She finds a way to funnel the exhaust fumes from the Merlins in the Hawker Hurricane aircraft into the wings to prevent them from icing up at altitude. Why didn't somebody else think of that? She did. And she has to get the aircraft shipped down from Fort William back to Halifax onto the Duchess of Athol, and the ship is waiting for the Hurricanes on June the 7th. She departs with the Hurricanes, 35 of them, and they arrive in Britain on the 21st of June, 3 weeks before the Battle of Britain begins. Elsie delivers. And she gives Cancar a contract, ultimately gains a contract for Cancar for the rest of the war to build Hurricanes. Not bad for someone we've never heard of before. On the same ship is Canada's first self-contained RCAF created fighter squadron. These guys are not among the 118. They have survived all the cuts through the 30s to military aviation, aircraft production and training. And among them is the man that Mike talked about with the booties earlier today, the man in the middle, Ernie McNabb. Quick story on Ernie. He was born and raised in Rostern, Saskatchewan, and I've been there many times. I remember the elevators, one of which was owned by his dad. And Ernie used to go to Sunday school, and one day he went in the family McNabb kilt, whereupon he takes a good deal of ridicule and he punches out the first guy whose lips out at him, and that was the end of the taunting and the criticism. Ernie goes on to lead the University of Saskatchewan boxing team and the football team, and ultimately enlists in the RCAF and rises to become its squadron leader just before it goes to Britain. In the meantime, in 1926, on the way, the CNE, which has now been inviting air crew and stunters and barnstormers to come to Toronto to show off at the end of the season around Labor Day, and the CNE invites the American aerobatic team. I think they were flying, is it Curtis Hawks? Is that right? Anyway, their aerobatic team comes, and then they think, oh, we better invite the Canadians. Well, Ernie is head of the group that's flying these. These were leading edge fighters at the time, which the RCAF had in some number, the Siskins, right? So Ernie thinks, how are we going to outstrip the Americans in this air show that's going on down by the lakeshore? And he comes up with this idea, essentially, to come up with something spectacular. He and his wingmates, Dave Harding and McGowan, invent a stunt to take the Siskins to altitude, which might be what? Help me here, guys. 8, 9, 10,000 feet, perhaps maximum ceiling, and throw all three of them in formation into uncontrollable spins descending. And then at about half the distance, come out of the spins in formation over the audiences, the spectators, who loved it. From Charlottetown to Vancouver, it was brilliant, spinning his Siskins into their hearts. But I maintain that that kind of flying made Ernie an excellent squadron leader and a survivor of the Battle of Britain. These guys wore these aircraft. Okay, the stages of the Battle of Britain, there's a lot of detail to go into each of these, but essentially the battle begins on the 10th of July. Incidentally, Reich Marshal Hermann Göring told Hitler in Hitler's demand that the skies be erased of the RAF by about September the 15th, when the summer weather is the best, the tides are the best. Hitler is going to launch Seelöwe, Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain, on or about September the 15th. In order to have the skies clear of the RAF, Göring says that'll only take 4 weeks. The battle goes for 113 days. Begins on the 10th of July. On the 12th of August, in that period, they're attacking shipping around Britain. We all learned in grade 5 social studies classes that Britain imports everything, from food to fuel and everything in between. Everything came from somewhere else. And if they could wipe out the merchant shipping around the British Isles the same way the U-boats were doing it out in the North Atlantic, they could essentially starve 40 million Britons. That was the objective in the first section of the Battle of Britain. Then they shift targets. And that was part of the problem with the Germans. They didn't necessarily think of this as a siege. They picked their cherries, if you like. And the second phase, from the 12th of August to the 6th of September, is the concerted attacks on RAF fighter squadron bases, aircraft production plants, and one day dedicated to attacking the radar stations, which is, again, a big mistake. However, in this period, from the 12th of August to the 6th of September, we come closest to losing the battle because Hugh Dowding, Air Chief Marshal of Fighter Command, fears most of all a battle of attrition, where the RAF fighters get tangled up with the Messerschmitts, the Luftwaffe fighters, and we get one, they get one, we get one, they get one. That attrition would eliminate the RAF from the battle in a month. He maintains the tactic should be for the RAF fighters simply to go after the bombers as much as possible, destroy or deflect or deter them as much as possible to essentially eliminate their impact on all of those targets across southern England. This is the period when we come closest to the Battle of Attrition. And then suddenly the Germans change their focus again. On the 24th of August, Goering, who's told, by the way, by Hitler not to attack London under any circumstances unless he gets permission from Hitler himself, Goering sends a formation of bombers to bomb East London, where the docks are, the power plants are, all the fuel and the warehouses are. The Germans overshoot the targets in the dark and they bomb London, and hundreds of civilians are killed. Churchill blows a gasket, sends Bomber Command to bomb Berlin, and all the gloves are off. And then the third phase of the Battle of Britain begins as Hitler decides to kill as many Britons in London as he possibly can. So Dowding views this as a gift. Civilians will pay a horrible price. 60,000 plus are going to die or be wounded or injured in the blitz that follows. But it allows the RAF to get up off the map, get the replenishing aircraft that Lord Beaverbrook is supplying into the lines and the pilots, and turn the tide and win the battle. This random cherry picking through the battle, the skirmishes that are not like Dowding's view of the battle, the siege. A couple of other interesting individuals, the few. On the eve of the climax of the Battle of Britain Sunday, the 15th, Butch Barton, who's been there all the way along, he comes from BC. He used to go on a steamboat from Kelowna on Okanagan Lake down to Penticton to go to school. He responds to the direct entry scheme invitation, gets there, gets a short service commission, serves with 249 Squadron throughout the battle. And then on the eve of the biggest battle of the entire siege, the 15th, here's the way he remembers it.
One day, we were told, this is your last day. Tomorrow, the invasion is going to occur. Well, that was not very encouraging. Holy Christmas. We've come this far, and this is where we are. We did everything to get at the enemy quickly. I'd come down from a considerable altitude above him, and I had speed on. At that time, he turned then and turned to fight, and I had a great difficulty in getting behind him again. Every time I closed up with him, he turned to fight. He climbed up into a cloud, and he thought he was going to be safe. It was just great. When I came out of the cloud, there he was in front of me. And that was his bad luck.
Now, in order to understand dogfighting, which I could never because I've never been in a cockpit like those young men were, I had to dig a little deeper into the combat reports. And as I did that, because I found Paul Pitcher's effects in a basement in Vancouver. Paul Pitcher was one of RCAF No. 1 Fighter Squadron, covered in dust, nobody was interested in them. And I found all the combat records for RCAF No. 1. Anyway, what I discovered was that the first iterations of the Spitfires and Hurricanes had something that I didn't realize they had, or didn't have what the Germans had. The German Messerschmitts had fuel injection. The early Spitfires and Hurricanes had carburetors. And as a result, the minute you threw the Spit or the Hurry into a steep climb or dive or roll or bank or whatever, the fuel drained away from the engine, the carburetor. So the engine sputtered. That's why he said, I had great difficulty getting behind him. The best position to be in a fighter aircraft was behind your enemy. And he had trouble getting there. Douglas Botter comes up with a short-term response to the problem. When he's doing an attempt to get into the position, he immediately threw the Spit he was in or the Hurricane he was in into a really quick inversion, And the centrifugal force of that move kept the fuel in the line enough to get him into the position of advantage. In the meantime, while the RAF and the Supermarine Spitfire people and the Hawker Hurricane people were developing fuel injection, an engineer named Beatrice Schilling came up with a device that was put inside the fuel lines. It was a small washer, which, if you can imagine a washer put inside the fuel line, keeps the fuel from draining away from the engine too quickly or over flooding it and making the engine sputter. And this saved lives. I don't mean to offend anybody, but at the time, the device was known, because it was a woman who devised this device, it was known as Miss Schilling's orifice. The device that prevented the fuel from draining away from the fuel lines. And until the fuel injection came along, that's what they did, and they managed. Okay, I got, I think, one more story. No, this is the story that Mike, you alluded to Skeets, right? And I had to include this because he's obviously here. He comes from Ottawa. He got his nickname for his fleet-footedness in football. He goes for the Short Service Commission. He's posted to RAF number 609 squadron. Again, these guys were not all in the same squadrons. They were scattered all across the 48 different squadrons that Dowding had at his disposal. He's up near Portsmouth, or at Middle Wallop, and I love this comment about some of his earliest flights. He said, "My insides were frozen and my heart was beating up where my tonsils should be." That was his reaction physically to the combat. Now, on the 15th, this is the voice of Skeets as recorded by his son, Keith, remembering what happened in his experience that day. We might want to boost the audio a little bit on this. Is at the back of the room? Okay, let's see if it comes through.
Spotted Dornier herring along by himself there. I figured he must have been hit and had lost of men. He's falling in behind out of the mass formation, and I took after him and got some pretty good attacks in on him. Third time I come in to attack, two of the crew bailed out. One of them almost went into my prop. He just went over the top. I ducked in the cockpit and this guy was gone. And then the old Dornier started twisting the air and fell over and then snapped in half, and the whole bits and pieces plummeted down into London. This was the aircraft that landed on Victoria Station, the aircraft that bombed Buckingham Palace. So I got a lot of free publicity out of that.
Now, the free publicity was there was a whole lot of argument as to who shot down that Dornier. 3 or 4 or 5 pilots did, and a lot of them had attacked it at different points in the battle. But Skeets, at this particular point, saw it fall apart. So did photographers on the ground who photographed the disintegration of the Dornier, and there's even a shot with Skeets's Spitfire peeling away in one of the photographs. Anyway, what's important here is that the final word on who shot down that Dornier on the 15th of September went to the Queen of the Netherlands, who happened to be staying at Buckingham Palace where the Dornier came down. And she saw the Spitfire tangle with the Dornier and reported to her adjutant or whoever it was, or her aide, to notify the squadron that the Spitfire and the pilot should be congratulated for the work he did in helping to bring that bomber down away from... Now, bombs actually fell into Buckingham Palace, but because they weren't set to explode, they simply crashed through the various floors at Buckingham Palace. The royal family wasn't there, but the Queen of Netherlands was, and she verified Skeets' kill. One last story. This is another sense of where the Canadians came from to be in the Battle of Britain. Johnny Kent was born and raised in Winnipeg. Wants to fly, like I suggested in anybody in the 30s. He gets his lessons from a Royal Flying Corps airman named Connie Johansson. I believe he was Icelandic. In any case, he describes Johnny's first solo as god-awful because he just about killed himself. He persists, and he becomes, in his era, the youngest licensed pilot in Canada. Johnny does, goes overseas in the direct entry scheme and gives the service. But he's there early, about 1934-35. So the first place they send him is to the Royal Aircraft Establishment, which is a fancy way of describing his work as a test pilot. And he gets to fly one of these things, those of us who've seen ferry battles will know that dynamics of the aircraft are similar. This is a ferry P-434. This was his test aircraft. His job is to test the effectiveness of tethered barrage balloons. These were located all along the coastline, essentially defending Britain against low-level attacks by bombers. Well, how do you test the efficiency of barrage balloons unless you crash into them? He did 300 successful controlled crashes into the dirigibles and gets an Air Force Cross. There he is going to Buckingham Palace to receive it from the King. But all he wants to do is to fight, right? So then they send him to a Spitfire squadron, and all of the armor plating around the cockpit has been removed to make the Spitfire lighter. All of the guns have been removed to make the Spitfire lighter. The radio has been removed to make the Spitfire lighter. All he's got is a camera. And he's doing high-level photography over Germany in late 1939 and sees the buildup of German troops on the Polish border. But he wants, they did one other thing to help him. They painted the underside of his Spitfire sky blue so that he disappeared into the altitude above Germany. That was his defense. Anyway, so all he wants to do is to fight. He finally gets assigned the job of becoming a flight commander within RAF number 303, All Polish Squadron. The same way the RAF dumped all the Canadians into 242 Squadron, they dumped all the Poles, many of whom had survived battles with the Luftwaffe over Poland in 1939, into 303. Now Johnny Kent is assigned the job of training them. None of them speaks any English. So he develops a phonetic language. He goes around the hurricane, he says aeroplane. The Poles say samolot. And he writes it down and puts it on a pad on his thigh. So when he's in the air, he can actually use the pad to, as a reference to work with the Poles. Now the Poles were not stupid. They had flown European constructed aircraft. And in the case of Polish aircraft, which of course used kilometers and liters as opposed to gallons and miles in Britain, in a Polish fighter aircraft, to increase the speed of the aircraft, to throttle up, you pull the throttle in the cockpit toward you. In a Spitfire or Hurricane, to throttle up, you push the throttle away. If you do that ass backwards in a battle, you're dead. But the real problem the Poles had was retractable undercarriages. When you took off in a Spit or Hurricane, the wheels folded up into the belly. The Poles kept forgetting to deploy the retractable landing gear. They were not stupid, they just had to learn. So Johnny Kent goes with them, and this is depicted in the movie, The Battle of Britain. Incidentally, that last scene from the Skeets tangle with the Dornier was from the Battle of Britain movie. This too.
Crying out loud. 2. Repeat, please. 3. 0. Repeat, please. Repeat, please. Now just shut up, the lot of you, and follow me. Unless you're blind as well as... Oh, God's truth.
Mach, dass du rauskommst! Mach schon!
One. The RAF is not a flying circus.
Po pierwsze, lotnictwo brytyjskie nie jest latającym cyrkiem.
2. Strict RT procedure will be observed at all times.
Po drugie, procedura radiowa będzie ściśle przestrzegana przez cały czas.
And it is never, repeat, never to be used.
I nigdy, powtarzam, nigdy nie będzie używana
For private Polish chit-chat.
na prywatne polskie rozmówki.
Finally, and God alone knows why, I've received the following signal. Congratulations, as of today, this squadron is operational. Signed Keith Park, Air Vice Marshal AOC 11 Group.
That's not how it happened. Kent is leading the Poles. The Poles spot the German bomber formation. They radio to Ron Kellett, who's the squadron leader, ahead of them get permission to leave the formation, attack the bombers, shoot 2 of them down, go back to the station, and Kent writes a letter to Keith Park saying, this squadron is now operational, ready to fight. In other words, in the movie, they use that tired old, the Poles are different from us attitude and the butt of the joke, when in fact, this was the moment in which their skill was recognized by a Canadian, not by a British officer or commander. A Canadian who's been training them recognizes that these men are ready to fight. Kent's relationship with the Poles through this period is amazing because he reflects on how these men came together. And here's what they did. As a squadron, in 42 of the 113 days of the battle, 42 days, they shoot down 126 German aircraft, more than any other squadron in the Battle of Britain. In 42 days. Quick anecdote here. Johnny Kent, seen here, second from the left, walking across away from the hurricane. He's with a number of his students, as it were. They're all aces. They've shot down more aircraft than he has. But they're out now on a sortie, and the Germans faced the problem in the Battle of Britain, running out of fuel in their fighter aircraft over Britain, the same way the RAF ran into the problem running out of fuel over France in the Battle of France. You got to quickly get back home to refuel. So Kent is chasing a Messerschmitt back across the French, to the French coast, and he's zeroing in on the Messerschmitt, and suddenly gets bounced by another Messerschmitt. Henneberg, second guy from the right, comes out of nowhere, draws that one Messerschmitt away, so that Kent can finish the job. They go back to the station to Northolt. Kent thanks Henneberg when they get back on the ground. He says, thanks for drawing that Messerschmitt away. Henneberg says there wasn't one, there were 6. Just shows you the skill level. Kent said the Poles were playing for keeps, and he learned from them as much as he taught them. It's because Canadians and Poles understood the meaning of the word task. It wasn't about snappy salutes or pressed pants. It was about accomplishing a task. Ironically, in 1946, when then Prime Minister Clement Attlee brings together all of the aircrew for a victory parade on May the 8th down the Mall, the Poles are excluded from invitation. Why? Because Attlee has just negotiated with Stalin for the gift of Poland to the Soviets. And he doesn't want to offend Stalin. Suddenly, all the aircrew in response, the British, the Canadians, the Americans, the Poles, everybody, not the Poles, the Czechs, the Australians, the New Zealanders, all of the Allied aircrew say, if the Poles don't march in this parade, we don't march in this parade. They stood up for the Poles. Attlee relents, sends out 25 invitations. The Poles say, thanks to you, we're not going in, forget it. Parade goes ahead. But again, it was a clear understanding, or lack of understanding on the part of the major players in the Battle of Britain of those who played a major part. So I finished with the relief that's along the Thames of the fighter pilots coming out of the dispersal hut. This is the wonderful relief showing them coming out of the wall, and remembering that 2,937 aircrew had participated in the battle and 544 died, including 20 Canadian pilots. The Luftwaffe incidentally lost 2,600 aircrew in the battle, but there were still 1,749 days of the war to go. So the Battle of Britain, in a way, fades into the rearview mirror, and so too does the story of the Canadians. So when I return to Churchill's line about never in the field of human conflict is so much owed by so many to so few, I just want to make sure that among the few we remember the many Canadians. Thank you. Questions?
Yes.
Good, let's go have a drink. Oh, I'm sure there must be some, because I've scooted through all this stuff so quickly.
This is the it's not on. This is the question he asked me to ask you. No, I'm just kidding. I'm kidding. What do you? Excuse me. In your opinion, what do you figure was the turning point in the Battle of Britain?
John, I generally don't go there. I leave those kinds of decisions or assessments to Mike and Alex. They're the academic historians. I'm not. My sense of the battle is down in the weeds with the women and men who are, the whole sections of this book I devote to ground crew. A guy named John Birds, who comes from BC in a lumber camp, gets trained as an aeromechanic, leads 150 air crew to Northolt and other stations in Britain, recognizes that he's got to teach all these young men with him how to be expert riggers and fitters. They keep the Hurricanes and the Spitfires in the air. Their motto is, for some of them, you bend them, we mend them. And they're working at night in the Blitz with hangars completely darkened so that the Germans can't spot any light spilling out from anywhere around the hangars, repairing the Hurricanes for 4:30 the next morning, all night long, with flashlights, and John Birds has them singing the Cab Calloway song, Minnie the Moocher, all night long. How much more absurd can that be? But it's the sinews that brought these young men together, and women, the engineers and so on, the Elsie McGills, to make this story so distinctively Canadian. When I first started this run 3 months ago, Peter Mansbridge called delightfully, and he's a good friend, and he asked me onto his podcast, and we did a half an hour, and the last question he asked me was, what are we supposed to take away of the Canadians' involvement in the battle? And I could have said, well, they were courageous, they were brave, they were young, blah, blah, blah. But no, it suddenly hit me that these guys were, as I said a moment ago, task-oriented. This was a job that had to be accomplished, and somehow, whether it was Ernie surviving the descents of the Siskins from 8,000 feet in uncontrollable spins, or Skeets overcoming his heart and his throat, or Kent recognizing the skill of the Poles to learn from them, they used what they knew to apply it in the battle, and it made a difference. So while they all disappeared into that RAF monolith, same uniforms, same caps, same ribbons and wings, somehow the Canadian imprint on this battle is what they brought to it. In every one of these cases, those young men and women were different from everybody else. And it disappears in that monolithic looking RAF, but when you look at what they did, it stands out like it shines. So I leave to Mike and Alex and others of you who are more astute in who won, who lost, and why. I think it's contained in some of the small cogs of the machine that really make the difference.
To the best of your knowledge, how many Canadians during Battle of Britain became aces?
I would say, and survived, I would say a dozen, maybe 15. Mike, Alex? They were not, the thing that was remarkable about the Canadians too in this squadron, look at Ernie. This is Ernie here. He turned 34 during the battle. Ideally, a fighter pilot is between 18 and 22. Gordon McGregor, his wingmate, turned 39. Hartland Molson turned 37. These guys were old men by comparison. And they start to flag on into October because they've been at it for 50 days straight. So there were not aces by virtue of longevity. They just were survivors. And I guess that's why more of them survived than maybe in other nationalities.
Interesting. I was interested by your numbers at the beginning. You stated that there were 7 Americans. Could they actually be included in the Canadian numbers, seeing as many of them came north to join the RCAF? And also, just another question, in your research, did you find any of them went directly to Britain to join us in the Short Service Commission scheme?
Did any of the Americans do that?
Yes.
Yeah. I wasn't able to unearth where the Americans ended up in the Battle of Britain because I wasn't following them particularly. Mm-hmm. If you think that they were Eagle Squadron members, they weren't then. Because the Eagle Squadron doesn't come to fruition until, correct me if I'm wrong, 1941. It's not until many more of the aircrew, and don't forget too, even though, and I cover this in my book Behind the Glory about the BCATP, the first graduates of the BCATP don't come on site until late 1940, and really not until 1941. The first real combat victories for graduates of the BCATP were the Norwegians over Dieppe in 1942.
Okay.
So there were, and I document this in Behind the Glory, there were 6,000 Americans in the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan up until December 7th, 1941. When the BCATP organizers said, or essentially the RCAF said, we haven't taken away your citizenship. You're free to go back to the States. And many of them did, literally on the next trains or planes out of town, and they became the nucleus of the U.S. Army Air Force, both instructors and squadron leaders. And they had the distinct advantage that they had been trained to fly at night. Remember that scene in Masters of the Air? Brilliant, brilliant scene where the Americans meet the British for the first time in a bar, and the British say, "Are you guys crazy flying in daylight with, bombing missions?" And the Americans say, "Are you guys crazy flying at night, bomber?" It's that one side did not know what the other experience was. And it was largely because the Americans hadn't learned to fly at night. Those who graduated from the BCATP had.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
So, first Eagle Squadron was September 1940. And it said Battle of Britain.
Okay, but I retract what I said. Then the 7 guys must have been Eagle Squadron. But I did check that out, and the first record I found was of Eagle Squadron reference was in early 1941. But there must have been some there that I wasn't aware of. But again, I was
41. The 3 squadrons are transferred to the 8th Air Force.
okay.
That's the wiki article.
That's the next book.
Anything more?
Thank you very much for the questions and your attention. Appreciate it.